Coming up on the programme, we'll hear from an infected blood victim on the final day of public hearings.
This is Times Radio.
With the very latest news, here's Jeremy Lieburn.
Lawyers have been making their closing statements in the long-running public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal. In the 1970s and 80s, patients got HIV and hepatitis C through infected blood products or transfusions imported from the US. The hearings were ordered 6 years ago by then Prime Minister Theresa May to look into the circumstances. Sam Stein is a lawyer representing 23 victims.
We don't apologise for our clients' visceral anger. We don't apologise for their desire for truth and for proper compensation for the damage done to them. Instead, let me be pinpoint clear, they are right to be angry and they are right to demand compensation.
First this afternoon, they are passionate, unrelenting and angry. The words of the lawyer representing victims of the infected blood scandal, the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, on this, the last day of a 4-year inquiry. Tens of thousands of people are thought to have been infected with HIV and hepatitis over 2 decades after being given contaminated blood. Sam Stein KC, representing 23 people, paid tribute to their years of campaigning for justice, for compensation and for changes to be made to ensure that such a scandal never happens again. In the next few minutes, we'll hear from a woman whose husband died of HIV in 1991 and from an MP who's long pushed for successive governments to acknowledge what went wrong and how the state failed so many for so long and with such devastating consequences. On our first this afternoon, the long-running inquiry into what has been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS concludes today. It looked into the circumstances in which patients were infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products imported from the US during the 1970s and 1980s. I'm now joined by Zoë Grünewald, political reporter at the New Statesman. Good afternoon, Zoë.
Hi, Cathy.
Just tell us what happened today, because, this has been years in the making, this inquiry, hasn't it?
Yeah, so today was kind of the last closing statement, set of closing statements. This inquiry has been running since 2018, but obviously this treatment disaster spans back to the 70s and 80s, so it's been decades for victims and the families of victims to seek any kind of redress, any kind of justice. Today we had the kind of final statements and the final statement from the chair of the committee as well, chair of the inquiry, sorry.
And there was a really passionate speech, wasn't there, by the KC representing the victims, which set out, the scale of their anger and just, the real sense that they've been let down by the state in such a fundamental way that and they've spent decades, some of them, pursuing justice.
Absolutely. I think one of the things she said was, this is not simply an inquiry into matters of history. This is an inquiry into the here and now. It's an inquiry into the ongoing relevance and resonance to decision making by government and the NHS today. So it shows you, this might have occurred back in the 70s and 80s, but it's still impacting people today. People are still dying. People still haven't received compensation. So it really is. It's very much ongoing. It's very much a live issue.
And tell us what happens now in terms of, the conclusions of the inquiry and what kind of compensation relatives might now get.
So the chair today, Sir Brian Lagstaff, said he'll be making an interim report about a framework for compensation, which will be published before Easter 2023. Now, that isn't the final report with the final set of recommendations. In that final report, we can expect kind of some more sort of dabbing recommendations for the government about accountability, where mistakes were, who should be taking accountability for those. But this compensation report, this interim report in Easter, will hopefully set out what compensation victims and the families of victims should be receiving. So it's important to know that last year, October 2022, victims were finally offered compensation of around £10,000 each. But actually only about 1 in 3 families were eligible for that payment for a number of quite complicated reasons as to how these payments were kind of given out. So, victims are still very much Most victims still haven't received any kind of compensation, and unfortunately, people will die during this process having received nothing.
Zoë Grünewald, political reporter at the New Statesman, thank you very much for setting the scene there. I'm joined now by Sue Threakall, who was personally affected by this scandal. Her husband tragically died of HIV in 1991. Good afternoon, Sue.
Hi, Cathy.
Also on the line with you, Labour MP Dame Diana Johnson, who's campaigned heavily on behalf of the victims. Dame Diana, welcome to the programme.
Thank you and good afternoon.
Sue, I want to start with you, if I may. Just if you could explain to us how it ended up that you and your husband have become embroiled in this whole medical disaster.
Well, in a way, it's a classic case of, it'll never happen to us, it's nothing to do with us, that sort of thing. You never think it will happen to you, but in our case, it did. And because Bob was a haemophiliac, severe haemophiliac, he ultimately contracted HIV and hepatitis C and hepatitis B, in fact, through his treatment. He was always sceptical about having the treatment. He used to say, well, you don't know what's in it, and how right that's proved to be. And if we could work that out as lay people, it just kind of indicates what was known by the doctors, by the scientists, by the pharmaceutical companies at the time. He finally died in 1991, as you mentioned earlier on.
And was he very ill, in the run-up to that? I'm assuming there were many years.
Desperately ill. I mean, you think of every image you've ever seen of a dying AIDS patient, and he was that.
And of course, at the time, there was a terrible stigma, wasn't there, about people with AIDS?
Oh, it was horrific. I mean, I know a person who had their house burnt to the ground. I know another family who had AIDS scum written in 6-foot-high letters across their house. I know families who had to move house because their children were denied an education because of their father having HIV and the story got out. Excuse me. I know of families who couldn't tell anyone what was going on, and when the person ultimately died, they said it was cancer because they were so frightened. None of which was helped, of course, by the government publicity at the time with crashing tombstones and don't die of ignorance, and people like Edwina Currie saying good Christian people will not get AIDS.
Terrible. I mean, obviously that is all that terrible story that you've told so succinctly is why this inquiry is so important. What does it mean to you that after years you might finally be getting close to the truth and to the compensation?
Well, I started campaigning in 1985 when there was no internet. Everything was done by snail mail and telephone. And I'm still campaigning today. I'm secretary of the campaign group Tainted Blood, and our main aim was to gain a public inquiry. The government are very fond of saying, oh, well, they're in it for the money, they're whiners, they're whingers. We've heard it all over the years. We've been called by the support services the great unwashed. Two of my friends by the same support services were called the Welsh terrorists, and all because the only thing we've done is to stand up and speak the truth again and again and again. And we've done it in the face of complete denial and abuse, in my opinion, from government. Everything's in the public domain. No, it wasn't. We did the best we could, given the knowledge at the time. No, you didn't.
Sue, stay there if you would, because I just want to turn now to Dame Diana Johnson, who has taken up your cause over the years. Diana, key moment today, the end of this inquiry. What do you think has been achieved by it, and what do you hope will now happen?
Well, can I first of all pay tribute to Sue and the many, many campaigners who over decades have fought to get justice, to get this public inquiry, and hopefully to get people compensated for what happened to them through no fault of their own. They were harmed by the state. So I think, we're on the final day of the hearing of the public inquiry. What I'm hoping now is that Sir Brian will produce that report on compensation by Easter. That's good news. I'm pleased to hear that. And then the full report by the summer. But your correspondent earlier on said this is still a live issue now. On average, one person dies every 4 days from this scandal. So it's really important that we get those reports out as soon as possible, and we get the government to act on them. We can't have any more delays from the government, and I'm hoping that Sir Brian will make clear what he's saying, particularly around compensation, by Easter. I think that's very welcome. And just to correct as well, there were interim payments paid at the end of last year, but they were £100,000 to certain groups, not all of those who'd been infected and affected. So there has been some positive move by the government, but there's a lot more to do.
And I mean, some of the evidence of this inquiry has been, well, it's all been distressing, but I was thinking particularly, for example, that at Trelawn's College, a state-run boarding school in Hampshire, 72 pupils, all haemophiliacs, later died after being given the contaminated treatment. And Diana, what's so distressing is that this was an avoidable scandal, wasn't it?
I think it was, and I think that's why the public inquiry and gathering together all the evidence and hearing from witnesses will show that action could have been taken, and that I don't know whether they're going to be able to establish negligence, but certainly these people, those boys at Trelawn's, were harmed by the state, and that has to be recognised. There has to be recognition of really what the state did to haemophiliacs. Of course, they were very, very badly affected by the contaminated blood scandal, but we also know that other people who received blood transfusions, perhaps in childbirth or after a car accident, they too developed hepatitis C and other conditions as well. So this has to be recognised. That's really important, what happened, and to learn from that as well.
Sue, I just want to come back to you for a final word. I wondered how you'd like to remember your husband and you know, the memories you'd like to have of him that are entirely separate from this scandal.
Oh, that's a tough one. But I suppose as a genuinely nice man, a really good husband and a fantastic father who should still be here today to be a father to those three boys. Do
you think he'd be proud of what you've done?
He'd probably think I was absolutely stark raving mad still doing it, after 4 decades. But yes, I think he would, because he felt it was important, and he enjoyed campaigning in a weird sort of way because he felt he was doing some good. He wanted the story to be out there. I don't think for a moment he would have thought it would take 4 decades. But thanks to people like Diana, and I'd like to return the compliment, Diana. I think we've got there. At least the truth is now out there, with statements given under oath, and it's backed up everything we've said all these years.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us this afternoon. It's an incredibly harrowing story, but a really crucially important one. And as you say, we are finally now getting to the truth and hopefully getting justice for those involved.
Closing statements have been heard in the long-running inquiry into the infected blood scandal, although its chair can't say when his final report will be completed. Hundreds of people contracted HIV and hepatitis C through blood imported from the US during the 1970s and 80s. We already know that compensation's been recommended for the victims. Sue Threakall was personally affected by the scandal. Her husband died of HIV in 1991. She's told Times Radio that the stigma around HIV at the time made the lives of people with it unbearable.
Oh, it was horrific. I mean, I know a person who had their house burnt to the ground. I know another family who had AIDS scum written in 6-foot-high letters across their house. I know families who had to move house because their children were denied an education because of their father having HIV and the story got out. I know of families who couldn't tell anyone what was going on, and when the person ultimately died, they said it was cancer because they were so frightened.